A movie is made up of images played back one after the other. These images are referred to as frames, and the rate at which they're played back is the frame rate. Frame rate is almost always expressed in terms of frames per second. For example, for this footage item here, we can see at the top of the project panel that its frame rate is 24 frames per second, meaning that this movie was shot recording one new image every 24th of a second. And this footage item here, the frame rate is 23.976 frames per second. Note that 23.976 is very close to 24. Very, very often, when people say that they have shot in 24 frames per second, they actually mean that they shot in 23.976 frames per second. 23.976 frames per second is the standard for shooting video that is meant to look like film. The reason that this is 23.976 instead of simply 24 is, frankly, a little confusing and buried in history, and is closely related to the fact that 29.97 frames per second is the standard frame rate for NTSC video instead of 30 frames per second. 29.97 frames per second is 999 over 1000 times 30 frames per second. Similarly, 23.976 frames per second is 999 over 1000 times 24 frames per second. You don't need to understand why this is the case. You just need to know that when someone says 24 frames per second, they very nearly always mean 23.976 in the context of video. This matters because if you conform a 23.976 frames per second footage item to 24 frames per second, or otherwise make the mistake of substituting one number for the other, you can end up with problems with audio-video sync, frame blending problems, softening of images, and so on. If we go down to the hiphopgirl.mov, we see that it has a frame rate of 29.97 frames per second, which is typical of many video standards. If we look at lemansturn.mov, it also has a frame rate of 29.97 frames per second, but we can tell from the fact that it has field separated with lower field first that this movie uses interlacing. So it's actually recording 59.94 fields per second, where two fields make up one frame. In all of these cases, the files contain information within them that tells After Effects what their frame rate should be. But we have an instance where that's not the case. This image sequence here has a frame rate of 30 frames per second, but image sequences don't actually contain information about their frame rate, so After Effects has to go by a default preference setting, or if you change the preference, by the setting that you've made. The default is 30 frames per second. If we want to change that, we can go to Edit, Preferences, Import, and change this to another value, such as 15. Now note that the item that I've already imported hasn't changed. It's still 30 frames per second. That preference only changes items that are newly imported. So if we import that again by double-clicking in the project panel, then navigating to the image sequence, clicking Open, the new item that's imported has a frame rate of 15 frames per second. We can change this after the fact by going to Interpret Footage, by right-clicking or control-clicking on macOS, choosing Main, and then setting a different frame rate. I'll say 10, and hit Enter. Let's see what practical result all of these different frame rates has in a composition. Here we have a composition that is at 24 frames per second. What that means is that each time we move the current time indicator to another frame, by going down into the timeline panel and pressing Page Down, After Effects is asking the various footage items that are used in the composition to give it the image information that for them is current at that time. And in a 24 frames per second composition, After Effects is making that request 24 times per second. But if we make this composition have different composition settings by choosing Composition Settings, and setting the frame rate to 59.94, for example, then, in this case, After Effects will make that request 59.94 times per second, asking each footage item to give its information that is current at that time. So, in the case of this police chase car, which, as we said, has a frame rate of 24 frames per second, if we move the current time indicator by pressing Page Down, and I'll say Page Down every time that I press it, Page Down, 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 page down. Notice that the image is only updating during some of the times that I press the page down key. That's because when After Effects is asking the footage item for its current image information, and it's doing so 59.94 times per second, this footage item doesn't have new information to give every time, because it was only shot at 24 frames per second. Let's put the Le Mans movie into this composition and do the same thing. Now, if I press page down, 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 each time I do so, there's new image information. That's because this footage item has a frame rate of 29.97, but a field rate of 59.94, meaning that there's new image information on every field 59.94 times per second, which matches up very nicely with this composition. By the way, that's why a lot of sports are shot with high frame rates and using interlacing, because it captures a lot of new information very frequently, as opposed to only once every 24th of a second in something like film. When you're ready to export, you can export at whatever frame rate you choose. So if we put this composition in the render queue, we go into Composition, Add to Render Queue. We can click on the name of the render settings here, which by default is Best Settings, and then choosing to use either the composition's frame rate or some other frame rate. If we're going out to, say, NTSC video, then we could have 29.97. And if we need to render fields, we'll choose to render fields. But if we're going out to, say, web video, we could choose something like 24 frames per second. And we wouldn't render fields because you don't need interlacing for video for computers. And click OK. After Effects can mix and match items of various frame rates within a composition without any problem, and it usually does a very good job of guessing the frame rate for items for which the frame rate is not expressed in the file. And since most items do express the frame rate in the file, this isn't even an issue. But there are some instances where After Effects will get the frame rate wrong, or where the file will be incorrectly labeled, in which case you now know where to go to change the frame rate for an imported item.